There's a very popular lie about respect, the idea that it stems from sympathy, excessive kindness, or a constant attempt to please everyone. But if you observe life more closely, just as Machiavelli did, you'll notice something unsettling. The world rarely respects those who constantly seek approval. In fact, the opposite is often true. The more someone tries to explain themselves, justify their decisions, or prove they are a good person, the less authority they project. It seems unfair, but it's part of a political system guided by reality, not ideals. Now think for a moment. Why do some people walk into a room and are immediately respected, while others have to talk all the time trying to convince others that they deserve attention? The difference is almost never in the position, the money, or the status. It's in the small, invisible behaviors, psychological gestures, word choices, strategic silence, and emotional posture. Great thinkers throughout history realized this long before we did. Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Jung, Marcus Aurelius, Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu. They all, in different ways, came to the same conclusion. Respect doesn't come from long speeches or endless explanations. It comes from presence, clarity, and emotional control. In this video, you'll discover 10 extremely powerful philosophical tricks that completely change how people perceive you. Some of them are counterintuitive. Others seem simple, but they have a huge psychological impact. And when you start applying these principles, strategic silence, emotional control, clear boundaries, and social intelligence, something curious happens. People start listening to you more, interrupt you less, and think twice before disrespecting you, because ultimately respect isn't something you ask for. Respect is communicated. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's a curious moment in human interactions when someone's authority begins to evaporate, and it almost always happens when the person starts explaining themselves too much. Machiavelli observed something simple yet brutally true. When someone feels the need to justify every decision, every word, and every action, they give the impression of asking permission to exist. And the world rarely respects those who constantly ask for permission. In the politics guided by reality, not ideals, people judge less by what you explain and more by what you uphold in silence. Think of that manager who decides something and starts talking for 5 minutes, trying to convince everyone that their decision was correct. Their authority diminishes with each sentence. Now compare that to someone who decides, explains the essentials, and moves on. It's not arrogance, it's clarity. It's understanding that virtue and fortune go hand in hand when one's posture conveys conviction. Those who constantly seek validation open themselves up to being challenged. And curiously, those who speak less frequently are listened to with much more attention. Consider a common scene at work or within the family. Someone makes a criticism, perhaps even an unfair one. The automatic reaction of many people is to launch into a defensive speech, explaining intentions, justifying every detail, proving innocence. But this movement creates an unexpected psychological effect. When you defend yourself too much, the other person begins to feel they have power over you. This is precisely where one of the sharpest insights associated with Machiavelli comes in. Authority doesn't come from the approval of others, but from the firmness with which you uphold your position. This doesn't mean acting aggressively. It means understanding that, in many moments of life, the end justifies the means in a strategic sense. Preserving your position is worth more than winning a pointless debate. Imagine a leader in a meeting simply saying, "This is the decision, let's proceed." No drama, no endless justifications. This type of posture communicates something powerful: emotional control and decisions based on real human nature. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you should never explain anything. Wisdom lies in balance. A smart strategist understands that excessive communication weakens the impact of the message. Think of great historical leaders or respected executives. They speak little, but when they do, everyone pays attention. It's the same principle as avoiding being hated without falling into the trap of constantly seeking approval. Have you ever noticed how some people enter a room and automatically draw attention even without saying much? That's presence. And presence is born from coherence between posture and decision. Those who constantly try to prove they are right seem insecure. Those who act naturally demonstrate a calculated use of force, even if that force is only psychological. And curiously, when you start talking less, people start listening more. But there's an even more powerful detail behind this, and it appears in the next principle: the unexpected effect of a brief silence before responding. There's a small gesture that seems insignificant, but completely changes the dynamics of a conversation. The 3-second silence before responding. It may seem like a detail, but in a politics guided by reality, not ideals, behavioral details often define who leads the interaction and who reacts to it. Imagine someone directly criticizing you in a meeting. Most people respond immediately, almost reflexively. This impulse reveals something profound, a need for approval. But those who master the game of strategic communication do something different. They stop, breathe, observe, and only then respond. This small pause creates a silent discomfort in the environment. The human brain interprets this pause as a signal of control and reflection. Suddenly the focus shifts. The person who made the criticism begins to wonder if they said something inappropriate. Silence, at that moment, becomes a subtle form of calculated use of force. This mechanism works because the human mind associates emotional speed with a lack of control. When someone responds too quickly, they convey reactivity, and reactivity is the opposite of authority. Machiavelli already suggested something similar when he observed that effective leaders cultivate constant adaptability, but never impulsiveness. A simple example: a boss asks why a project is delayed. The nervous employee starts explaining frantically. Someone who understands this dynamic looks calmly, pauses, and says, "There was a delay. We are already correcting it. That's all." No drama, no endless justifications. This behavior communicates something powerful: emotional mastery. It's the difference between someone trying to defend themselves and someone who is leading the situation. In practical terms, you can start applying this in everyday conversations. When someone asks a difficult question, mentally count 1, 2, 3, then answer. This small ritual completely changes how others perceive you. Interestingly, this technique also alters the way you think. A few seconds of silence activates a more rational part of the brain. Instead of reacting impulsively, you begin to choose your words strategically. This is deeply connected to the idea of virtù and fortuna, the ability to act intelligently at the right moment. People who master this type of communicative pause often seem naturally confident, when in fact they are simply training emotional control. And this control creates a curious psychological effect. Those who speak calmly convey security. Those who react quickly convey anxiety. In competitive environments, whether business, politics, or even social interactions, this difference becomes decisive. It's no coincidence that effective leaders rarely speak first in tense discussions. They observe, they evaluate, they calculate, because they know that hasty words can destroy reputations. And here arises an interesting reflection raised by Nietzsche. Why do so many people feel an almost compulsive need to justify themselves all the time? Nietzsche had an almost uncomfortably accurate psychological insight. Most people live trying to justify their own existence. They explain decisions, defend preferences, seek validation for simple opinions, and, without realizing it, they surrender their own power. When someone feels the need to justify every step, they are already accepting an inferior position in the conversation. It's as if they are silently saying, "You have the right to judge me." In a view inspired by Machiavelli, who observed life as a politics guided by reality, not by ideals, this is a strategic error, because true authority is born when you take responsibility for your decisions without asking for emotional permission. Think of someone who says, "This was the choice I made." Period. No speech, no defense. This type of posture communicates something that few people master today: silent self-confidence. In competitive environments, work, business, or even personal relationships, this difference completely changes the balance of power. Nietzsche believed that many justifications stem from the fear of rejection. People fear not being accepted, so they try to convince the world that their decisions are correct. However, this behavior generates the opposite effect: perceptible fragility. Those who observe perceive the insecurity, and when insecurity appears, authority disappears. This is where a strategic perception associated with the concept of virtù and fortuna comes in. Those who trust their own decisions don't need immediate applause. Think of an entrepreneur who chooses a different path from the majority. If they spend all their time explaining why they did it, they convey doubt. Now imagine another who simply executes. Time takes care of showing the results. This type of posture reflects something that ancient strategists understood well. Decisions based on real human nature have more impact than elaborate speeches. If you want to apply this in practice, start with small things. Instead of over-explaining why you chose something, a project, an idea, a positioning, simply stand by the decision. Of course, this doesn't mean acting arrogantly or ignoring intelligent opinions. The point is different. Authority is born when you don't surrender your emotional position to others. Nietzsche called this inner strength. Machiavelli would see it as a strategy for social survival. Both realized that the world respects more those who demonstrate conviction. There's a curious detail here. People who constantly try to please others end up being less respected than those who clearly disagree. This happens because the human mind values consistency. Those who try to please everyone convey instability, and instability breeds distrust. Those who stand by their choices demonstrate a silent kind of power, something close to the principle of avoiding being hated, but also of not constantly seeking approval. Ultimately, abandoning the habit of justifying everything is one of the first steps to building presence. But there's an even more powerful tool to protect that presence when it's attacked: strategic silence. There's a skill few master, but it separates respected people from those constantly questioned, knowing when to stop talking. Silence, when used intelligently, acts as a psychological shield. When you over-explain, you open doors to debate, dispute, and emotional negotiation. But when you state a decision clearly and end the discussion, something different happens. People perceive limits. Machiavelli deeply understood this mechanism, observing that leadership requires a policy guided by reality, not ideals. In other words, good intentions aren't enough. You need to maintain your stance. Think of a leader saying, "This is the direction we're going to take." No beating around the bush, No long speeches. This conveys control. Interestingly, when you speak less, others think more. Silence creates a space where people begin to interpret your firmness as security. It is precisely at this point that your presence is strengthened. Now observe how the opposite works. Imagine someone making a decision and immediately starting to justify it. I did this because, maybe it's better because, I thought that. Each sentence opens a gap for debate. Suddenly, what was a decision becomes an endless discussion. This is where a classic principle associated with strategic thinking appears: the calculated use of force. Sometimes force lies not in imposition, but in clarity. A simple decision, stated calmly and followed by silence, has much more impact than 10 minutes of explanation. A practical example: in a meeting, someone questions your position. Instead of engaging in an emotional debate, you calmly respond, "This is the choice I consider correct." And then, silence. The discomfort shifts. The person who questioned now needs to decide if they really want to continue confronting someone who seems completely sure. This small dynamic completely alters the balance of power. This behavior also connects to one of the most interesting principles linked to virtù and fortuna, the ability to act with emotional intelligence under pressure. People who master silence are not cold or indifferent. They simply understand that not every provocation deserves a lengthy response. In many cases, over-explaining only fuels the conflict. And those who master strategic communication know that decisions based on real human nature need to consider the egos of those around you. The more you argue, the more the other person feels they need to win the debate. But when you remain calm and limit your words, the atmosphere changes. Respect begins to emerge naturally. This doesn't mean seeking confrontation, but it also doesn't mean constantly retreating. In fact, this is precisely where an important question arises: how to maintain dignity and emotional stability when someone tries to attack your position. Schopenhauer had a direct and almost brutal view of dignity. It is rarely stolen, almost always surrendered. In other words, the world may try to disrespect you, but the real loss occurs when you react desperately, trying to prove your worth at any cost. In the society where human interactions function as a true politics guided by reality, not by ideals, dignity becomes a kind of invisible capital. Whoever preserves it transmits strength. Whoever trades it for approval transmits weakness. Machiavelli observed something similar when analyzing leaders who sought to be loved at any price. He warned that often it is better to be feared than loved, as long as one knows how to avoid being hated. This balance requires something rare: emotional control in the face of provocation. Think of someone who receives unfair criticism and calmly responds, "I understand your point. That's all." No attack, no submission. Dignity remains intact. In practice, dignity doesn't mean rigidity or excessive pride. It means knowing when it's not worth engaging in certain emotional games. Schopenhauer observed that many discussions aren't really about ideas, but about ego. Those who engage in this type of dispute often come out worn down. Imagine a workplace discussion where someone tries to diminish your competence in front of other colleagues. The instinctive reaction of many people would be to defend every detail of their work. But an emotional strategist acts differently. They maintain their composure, respond objectively, and move on. This type of attitude communicates something powerful: security. It's the same logic that appears in the classic strategy of calculated use of force. Force doesn't always need to be visible. Sometimes strength lies in not reacting impulsively. This behavior creates a perception of stability, something essential for those who wish to build lasting respect. There is also a fascinating psychological detail in this behavior. When someone tries to attack your dignity and realizes that you are not reacting emotionally, the effect is usually unexpected. The aggressor begins to lose strength. This happens because many provocations depend on the other person's reaction to sustain themselves. Without a reaction, the conflict loses fuel. This principle deeply relates to the idea of decisions based on real human nature. People frequently test social boundaries. When they encounter someone who maintains a firm stance without aggression, respect tends to arise naturally. It is at this point that dignity transforms into presence. A silent but perceptible presence, something that doesn't need to be announced. And curiously, when this presence begins to appear, an even more interesting skill emerges: the ability to reflect the emotional energy of the attacker without absorbing it. There is an extremely powerful social skill that few people develop: the ability to act as an emotional mirror. Instead of absorbing someone's aggression or tension, you simply reflect that energy back without carrying its weight. It seems simple, but it is profoundly strategic. When someone tries to provoke, humiliate, or attack, they usually expect an immediate emotional reaction. It's almost a human reflex. However, in a politics guided by reality, not ideals, whoever masters their own emotional state completely changes the game. Imagine someone speaking aggressively to you. Instead of raising your voice or engaging in confrontation, you calmly respond. You seem quite irritated. That's all. No accusation, no attack. At that moment, the emotional energy returns to the one who created it. This small gesture reveals something important: psychological control. And psychological control is a silent form of calculated use of force. This principle frequently appears in negotiations, leadership, and even personal relationships. Emotionally mature people don't try to win arguments through intensity, but through stability. Consider an everyday example. A co-worker starts speaking sarcastically about one of your decisions. Many people would react by defending their own position or trying to prove they are right. Someone who understands the concept of emotional mirroring responds simply, "Interesting that you see it that way," and then changes the focus of the conversation. This type of response creates a curious phenomenon. The aggressor loses the emotional stage they were seeking. Without conflict, the provocation loses its meaning. It is precisely here that traits of virtù and fortuna appear: the ability to act with emotional intelligence at the right moment. Those who master this technique transmit an almost magnetic presence because they demonstrate something rare: emotional independence. There is also a profound psychological effect in this behavior. When someone projects aggression and encounters only calm, they begin to see themselves more clearly. It's like looking into an unexpected mirror. Often the person themselves realizes the exaggeration of their own attitude. This dynamic is directly linked to decisions based on real human nature. The human ego needs reaction to sustain conflict. Without reaction, the confrontation loses fuel. Of course, this doesn't mean passively accepting disrespect. The goal is not submission, but balance. You maintain your position without entering the other person's emotional war. This type of posture creates something very interesting over time: silent respect. People realize that you are not easily provoked, and when someone cannot be easily destabilized, they begin to transmit a much stronger presence. But there is an even deeper source of this presence, something that Jung himself called the integration of the shadow. Carl Jung observed something many people prefer to ignore. Within every human being lies a part he called the shadow. These are impulses, emotions, and characteristics that we learn to hide in order to be socially accepted. Ambition, anger, desire for power, the will to win, all of this is often repressed because it seems incompatible with the image of a good person. The problem is that when this energy is repressed, it doesn't disappear. It transforms into insecurity, fear of confrontation, and a constant need for approval. In a politics guided by reality, not ideals, denying these parts of one's own nature weakens personal presence. Interestingly, ancient strategists like Machiavelli perceived something similar when analyzing leadership. They understood that human beings possess contradictory impulses and that ignoring this reality creates weak leaders. Integrating the shadow means recognizing these internal forces and learning to direct them intelligently, transforming impulse into strategy. When someone accepts this inner dimension, something interesting happens. The person stops trying to appear perfect and begins to act with more authenticity. And authenticity generates respect. Think of leaders who demonstrate firmness without needing to feign virtue all the time. They don't need to convince anyone that they are strong. Their posture already communicates that. This type of presence is deeply connected to the idea of virtù and fortuna. Virtù, in this context, represents the ability to act with courage and intelligence in the face of circumstances. Fortuna represents the unpredictable events of life. Those who integrate their own shadow begin to deal better with both. A practical example, imagine someone who has always avoided conflict to appear agreeable. By recognizing this tendency, this person can begin to develop an important skill, disagreeing respectfully. Instead of suppressing their own opinion, they learn to express it clearly. This doesn't automatically create enemies. In fact, it often increases the respect of those around them. There's also a strategic detail in this process. When you accept your own contradictions, you become much harder to manipulate. People who constantly try to maintain an appearance of absolute virtue often hide their insecurities, and these insecurities can be exploited. Those who acknowledge their strengths and imperfections convey something much more solid. This behavior reflects an essential principle of decisions based on real human nature. Nobody is completely rational or completely moral all the time. By accepting this, you gain psychological freedom. You no longer need to feign perfection to be respected. On the contrary, emotional honesty creates a much more authentic presence. Interestingly, when someone integrates their own shadow, something unexpected happens. The responsibility for how others treat them becomes much clearer. And it is precisely at this point that a powerful reflection brought by Sartre comes in. Jean-Paul Sartre defended an idea that initially bothers many people, but becomes liberating when deeply understood. You are responsible for how you allow yourself to be treated. This doesn't mean you control the behavior of everyone around you. It means that, in most human interactions, you teach people how they can act towards you. In a politics guided by reality, not ideals, the boundaries you silently establish define your social space. If someone makes a disrespectful joke and you laugh awkwardly to avoid conflict, the other person's brain interprets this as permission. If the situation repeats itself and you continue to tolerate it, that behavior becomes the new standard. Now imagine another reaction. You remain calm and respond naturally, but firmly. I prefer not to engage in that kind of joke. No attack, no drama, just a clear boundary. This type of posture communicates something powerful, self-awareness, and the calculated use of emotional force. Sartre said that many people confuse guilt with responsibility. Guilt paralyzes, responsibility empowers. When you believe that everything bad happens simply because the world is unfair, you remain stuck in a passive position. But when you understand that you can influence how people interact with you, you begin to act more strategically. This idea resonates deeply with a principle observed by Machiavelli when studying leadership. Respect rarely arises solely from good intentions. It appears when there is coherence between posture and action. This is why effective leaders often combine cordiality with firmness. They know how to avoid being hated, but they also don't put themselves in a position of emotional submission. A practical example appears in professional environments. Imagine a colleague constantly interrupting you in meetings. Many people simply accept this. Someone who understands this dynamic calmly responds, "Let me finish my thought." Simple, clear, and extremely effective. There's also an interesting psychological aspect to this dynamic. When you calmly establish boundaries, you convey something that the human brain interprets as stability. People tend to respect those who demonstrate emotional consistency. This connects to the principle of virtù and fortuna, the ability to act intelligently in the face of circumstances without losing one's own direction. Respect isn't something demanded through shouting or constant imposition. It arises when people realize that certain boundaries simply cannot be crossed. And curiously, when these boundaries begin to exist, your presence changes. You start to occupy the space more naturally, without needing to convince anyone of anything. But maintaining this kind of posture requires an essential inner skill: mastering one's own emotions. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and one of the great thinkers of Stoicism, taught something that remains extremely relevant today. True power begins when you realize you don't need to react to everything. Most people live in a state of constant reaction. Someone criticizes, they react. Someone provokes, they respond immediately. But those who live like this end up surrendering their own emotional control to the environment. In a politics guided by reality, not by ideals, this means losing influence. Marcus Aurelius observed that emotions are not enemies, but they also shouldn't become the commanders of the mind. Feeling anger, frustration, or indignation is human. The problem begins when these emotions start dictating decisions. It is precisely at this point that a silent type of power appears, the ability to observe what is happening within oneself before acting. And curiously, this ability creates a presence very similar to what strategists like Machiavelli would call a leadership posture. Imagine a common situation. Someone tries to provoke you in public, perhaps in a meeting or discussion. The automatic reaction would be to respond in the same tone, but someone who practices emotional control does something different. They observe the emotion arising, recognize the impulse, and choose not to act immediately. That small space between stimulus and response changes everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote something very simple in his diaries. You have power over your mind, not over external events. This principle connects directly to decisions based on real human nature. The world will continue to be unpredictable. People will continue to have opinions, criticisms, and attacks. But those who master their own minds transform these situations into opportunities to demonstrate stability. A practical example. Instead of responding to an irritating comment in the moment, you can calmly say, "I'll think about it." This simple phrase creates space for reflection and conveys something extremely rare today: emotional maturity. There is also a strategic effect to this. People who maintain emotional control are perceived as trustworthy in times of pressure. Effective leaders often demonstrate this characteristic. In crisis situations, while others panic, they remain calm. This behavior reflects a balance between virtù and fortuna, skill and circumstance. Those who master their own minds can react more intelligently to unexpected changes in life. And this kind of stability creates something curious: spontaneous respect. People begin to realize that you are not easily manipulated by momentary emotions. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means acting consciously. However, mastering emotions is only part of the strategy. There is also a fundamental element that defines whether an action will be effective or not: the right moment to act. Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist of the art of war, observed something that remains one of the most powerful laws of strategy. It is not enough to act with force or intelligence. It is necessary to act at the right moment. Many people believe that respect comes from the ability to react quickly, to show strength immediately when confronted. But in a politics guided by reality, not by ideals, acting too soon can be as harmful as not acting at all. Sometimes responding immediately reveals anxiety or insecurity. Those who master the timing of their response demonstrate something far more valuable: self-control and strategic vision. Consider someone who receives a public provocation. Instead of reacting impulsively, this person observes, assesses the context, and chooses the appropriate moment to respond, or decides that a response is not even necessary. This behavior is very reminiscent of Machiavelli's logic, who understood that leadership involves calculating consequences before acting. This principle appears in countless real-life situations. In negotiations, for example, whoever speaks first often loses an advantage. An experienced negotiator knows that silence can reveal more information than direct questions. In the professional environment, something similar happens. Imagine a colleague trying to diminish your contribution to a project in front of the team. The emotional reaction would be to confront immediately, but someone who understands strategic timing can simply observe and wait for the right moment, perhaps when the project results appear or when there is an opportunity to present concrete data. This choice demonstrates a calculated use of force. It's not about avoiding confrontation, but about choosing when it truly makes an impact. Sun Tzu taught that winning without fighting is the most efficient form of victory. In practical terms, this means that many social battles can be won simply with posture and timing. There's also a very interesting psychological aspect to this. People who react impulsively are predictable. Whoever provokes them already knows exactly what their reaction will be, but someone who controls the timing of their response becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability generates respect. This behavior connects directly to the idea of virtù and fortuna, strategic skill combined with the correct reading of circumstances. In many cases, waiting a few days before responding to criticism or choosing a more appropriate environment to clarify something completely changes the outcome of the interaction. It's like in a game of chess. The best move isn't always the fastest, but the most well calculated. And when someone starts acting with this kind of intelligence, something interesting happens. Leadership begins to emerge almost naturally, without the need for imposition. Lao Tzu, one of the great thinkers of Eastern philosophy, described a type of leadership that seems almost paradoxical. Leadership that doesn't force authority. For many people, respect is associated with imposition, speaking louder, giving orders, showing power all the time. But Lao Tzu observed something much more sophisticated. The most effective leader is often the one whose influence seems natural, almost invisible. In the politics guided by reality, not ideals, this means understanding that true power rarely needs to be constantly displayed. Think of someone who enters a meeting and immediately starts bossing everyone around. The internal reaction of the people is usually resistance. Now imagine another person who asks questions, listens attentively, and calmly guides the conversation. Without realizing it, everyone begins to follow their direction. This type of presence is very reminiscent of Machiavelli's logic, who understood that efficient leadership involves emotional strategy and reading human behavior. A simple example helps to understand this principle. Imagine two different managers. The first says, "Do exactly as I say." The second asks, "What's the best way to solve this?" In the first case, people obey out of obligation. In the second, they participate in the solution. Interestingly, the second manager often earns much more respect. This happens because true leadership involves social intelligence. Lao Tzu suggested that effective leaders create space for others to feel part of the process. This behavior reflects something very close to the concept of virtù and fortuna, the ability to handle circumstances and people simultaneously. Those who master this dynamic realize that authority is not born solely from hierarchical position, but from the ability to generate trust. And trust, unlike fear, tends to last much longer. There's also a strategic detail in this type of leadership. When you guide people calmly and clearly, they begin to see you as a natural reference point. This is linked to the idea of decisions based on real human nature. Human beings tend to resist direct imposition, but respond much better to intelligent guidance. That's why truly effective leaders rarely need to repeat orders multiple times. Their posture communicates conviction. At the same time, they know how to avoid being hated because they don't use authority aggressively or unnecessarily. This balance creates a kind of silent influence, something that seems simple but requires emotional maturity and strategic vision. And when someone begins to master this type of presence, a final skill emerges that transforms respect into credibility. The ability to disagree without destroying relationships. There's a very common social error that silently destroys credibility: agreeing with everything. Many people believe that showing respect means always validating the opinions of others. But Nietzsche observed that excessive agreement often reveals a lack of identity. When someone agrees with everything, they convey the feeling that they don't have their own thoughts. In a politics guided by reality, not ideals, this weakens personal authority. Interestingly, respected leaders and thinkers are rarely those who say yes all the time. They know how to disagree, but they do so intelligently. Here again, an idea associated with Machiavelli's strategic thinking appears: preserving relationships while maintaining your position. It's not necessary to attack the other to defend an idea. In fact, when you separate people from arguments, you demonstrate maturity and intellectual confidence. A practical example appears in professional debates. Imagine a meeting where everyone quickly agrees to a proposal, perhaps just to avoid conflict. An attentive strategist might say something simple: "I understand that point, but I'd like to explore another perspective." This phrase does something powerful. First, it demonstrates respect. Second, it introduces critical thinking. This type of stance creates credibility because it shows intellectual independence. People begin to realize that you are not there just to please, but to contribute real ideas. This reflects the balance between firmness and diplomacy, something very close to the principle of the calculated use of force. You don't confront aggressively, but you also don't abandon your own vision. This combination often generates spontaneous respect because it demonstrates that your position doesn't depend on the immediate approval of others. There is also an important psychological effect to this skill. When someone disagrees clearly and respectfully, the conversation becomes richer. Ideas are tested, refined, and strengthened. This creates an environment of intellectual growth. People who master this skill are often seen as natural leaders in complex discussions. They don't engage in ego battles, but neither do they hide behind permanent silence. This behavior demonstrates something fundamental in terms of virtù and fortuna: the ability to act intelligently in the face of social circumstances. Ultimately, respect rarely arises from submission or aggression. It emerges when someone demonstrates clarity, emotional balance, and intellectual courage simultaneously. And when all these skills combine, strategic silence, emotional control, dignity, and independence of thought, something very interesting happens. The way the world reacts to you changes completely. Now stop for a moment and think honestly. How many times throughout your life have you tried to earn respect by over-explaining, trying to please, trying to prove that your decisions made sense to everyone? Most people do exactly that. And that is precisely why they continue to be ignored, interrupted, or underestimated. But throughout this video, you realize something that great thinkers understood centuries ago. Respect rarely comes from the approval of others. It comes from attitude. It is born when you speak less and observe more, when you decide clearly, when you control your emotions while others lose control. This is where those quiet qualities that strategists like Machiavelli understood so well come in. A balance between virtue and fortune, the calculated use of force, decisions based on real human nature, and the ability to avoid being hated without giving up one's own position. And now the important question is not philosophical, it's practical. Starting tomorrow, are you going to keep reacting to everything that happens around you, or are you going to start implementing these strategies? He's going to keep over-explaining his decisions. Or will you learn to speak less and maintain your presence? He'll keep trying to please everyone, or will it finally establish clear boundaries? Because the truth is simple, people treat you the way they've learned they can treat you. And that can change the moment your attitude changes. Now I want to know something. Which of these principles resonated with you the most? Strategic silence, stoic emotional control, or the idea that you teach people how they should treat you? Write it in the comments. I really want to read it. And if you enjoy content like this, philosophy applied to real life, mental strategy, emotional intelligence, and principles from great thinkers like Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Jung, and Sun Tzu, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, we don't talk about pretty ideas. We talk about ideas that change the way you play the game of life. See you in the next video.